Välkommen alla sammen! Did the Vikings and the English understand each other? The way TV shows portray it is usually like a rough start. They can't understand each other in the first meeting and they're in confusion, but eventually they start to understand each other perfectly. But what was the reality? Fortunately, this is actually what I did my bachelor's thesis in, so I'm going to give you a summary on that. I'll also show you some examples of the language so you can see for yourself, and I'll also go some of the old sources we have between the Vikings and the English, and then I'll send you guys to a video of two other great YouTubers that actually speak about these languages and speak these today. And finally, I've got a rant at the end of the video of yet another example how ancient humans were actually better off and better at things than we were today. So, my thesis was actually about the Old Norse influence on the English language, and the amount of loan words and the language influence and things like that. We can see exactly how much the Norse were actually integrated in English society at the time. It was almost like a Creole language, not quite to that extent, but it's getting there. It's not quite the right word, but almost getting there. So, of course, one can expect words like berserk, die, ransack, those English words, we can expect those to come from Old Norse, right? But there are hundreds of other words brought into English that show a far more peaceful and integrated cohabitation of the Norse and English. But the real question we have to come to when looking at this subject is how many of these Old Norse words are a direct import into the English language, and how many of them are just a merger of the two because they were so similar in the first place. Here is just a few examples of the exact same text in Old Norse versus in Old English. Okay, close, but I definitely think they would have had a difficult time understanding each other. Okay, I know they probably could negotiate trading with each other, trade me some fish for some silver pieces, but deep, in-depth conversation seems like it would be very difficult from looking at these examples. Other Germanic languages of the time, same thing. Old High German at the time, Old Frisian, Old English, and Old Norse. They might be close enough to have kind of trade and basic conversation with each other, but deep talks would be difficult. But you have to remember, if we go back about 600 years before the Viking Age, we were just different Germanic tribes, and we were all speaking the same language anyway. It's a dead language with no real preserved text of it, but we call this the Proto-Germanic language. And of course, there would have been some regional differences and dialect, but effectively the same language. Fast forward then 600 to 800 years, and we all had different languages here in the Viking Age. We could all understand each other in simple conversations probably, and it would get a bit better with time. But in my opinion, I think they could understand each other a whole lot better than we think, actually. When we look at the sagas and chronicles of the Viking Age and before, there are countless mentions of the English and the Norse coming into contact. Not once is a translator mentioned in any of the texts, not in England or Frisia or Saxony or the east of Europe where the Norse had contact too. But there are sources mentioning contact with the English, say the Franks or the Romans or the Byzantines or whatever. In these sources, a translator or interpreter is mentioned as communicating between the two kings much more often. So there really is plenty of evidence that all the Germanic languages of the time understood each other well enough, not just for basic trade or, business, like, hey, you give me 15 fish, I give you 2 shield, okay? But they understood each other well enough to have complicated, detailed peace talks, legal conversation, and really in-depth, friendly relations even. Now, of course, there are, documented talks between royalty and diplomats of the Viking Age. Of course, a Viking king could have been educated at least a little bit in Old English, and the English kings and bishops would have made their business to learn some Old Norse at least. And later on in the Viking Age, when Christianity came in, they would all have good knowledge of Latin anyway. But we would have hundreds of stories of regular people too, and you will find a lot more of these in the sagas of the Icelanders, great heroes of Iceland from the Viking Age, like Egil or Kjartan. They had plenty of close relationships with the English. These guys were basically hillbillies from the backwoods that you're going to find in sagas of the Icelanders. They would not have had the same education in Old English as, say, a Royal Norwegian or a Royal Dane would have had at the time. For example, Egil Skallagrimsson, he would have never even heard Old English really, except for on a trading boat maybe a couple times a year coming to Iceland, or maybe slaves that they had to deal with that were bringing in. So when Egil was still a young man, he brings his big ass to England and fights randomly in a battle on the side of the English, the King Athelstan, and the two end up hanging out together for months and becoming lifelong friends. In another story, a guy named Kjartan, another hillbilly from Iceland pretty much, he was once shipwrecked off the coast of Ireland, and he made a full negotiation with the Irish patrolmen there basically to bring the king there, and the king found him, and they found out that they were related actually, so it wasn't just the educated people and royalty who understood each other. Any basic Norse or Englishman could really understand without too much difficulty, it seems, from the sources. But that's all I have to say about it. Enough of me talking. You guys should go watch some real experts if you haven't watched it already. Two great professors, Jackson Crawford and Simon Roper. These two guys are in the modern day, and they actually speak Old Norse and Old English, and they test it out themselves and see how well they understood each other, basically. It was with a bit of difficulty, but they understood each other for the most part. And don't forget, this is a second language for these guys that they learned in school, and they're two dead languages with nobody to speak and practice with regularly. So if you you were there 1,000 years ago and you grew up speaking these languages, it would have gone even smoother than their conversation that you can see. So definitely check out their channel. Yeah, you guys ask me about Jackson Crawford all the time. I like him a lot. I really do like him. Yes, some of our opinions and theories differ. That's because Jackson Crawford is a linguist, okay? He's not an expert in the study of religion, and that's totally cool. That's not his job. That's nothing against him. He is an expert on the language, the literature, the poetry, those types of things, runes. He is far better than me and knows way more than me and anything else. But when it comes to the Norse religion or any kind of primitive cultural religion, he's not even there. I could give you a list of 200 people that have a lot more knowledge than he does. So it's you guys that are making him the expert in the Norse religion, but he has never claimed to be, and he doesn't want to be either. He's an expert in the language and literature, and we should be thankful that he's on YouTube and making these videos. But yeah, that's why my opinions and his opinions that he speaks about in his videos differ on things, but I still like the guy a lot. So yeah, check that video out. And yeah, in my opinion too, the Old Norse and the English and pretty much all the other Germanic languages of the time understood each other fantastically. Even though the languages do not look that close to us in writing, and they're separated by about 600-700 years of evolution, so you guys can maybe compare that to, we don't really have an equivalent today that I can think of. It wouldn't be as easy as, say, like British English communicating with American English, but maybe we can say Dutch to Afrikaans in South Africa. It's difficult, and they're spread by 400 or 500 years, but they can understand each other. Us today, that's if we were supposed to understand like Shakespearean English, just separated by 500-600 years of history. Or maybe if you took today some redneck from the backwoods of some middle of nowhere state in the US.
I went and got my pistol and put it in my pocket in case he come and bust my door.
And you made him speak to a guy in the far north of Scotland with the thickest accent.
Nearly 26 years ago.
They would both have a very hard time of understanding each other, even though the language on paper is a lot more similar than Old Norse and Old English were. So what does all this tell us? Well, ancient humans, not just in old times, but even today, more primitive cultures that These people are much better with language and communication than our so-called civilized culture, right? How is that? They're primitive cultures, and most of them can't even read and write. Some today, and definitely back 1,000 years ago, most people couldn't read and write. Well, that's exactly the problem, I think. When you instill in kids from an early age this kind of anal grammar and spelling and enunciation and all that other crap, it actually makes us humans worse at understanding each other in the long run. Have you guys ever traveled to like third world countries? I've been to a lot of them. I don't speak their language, and maybe they only speak a few words of English. But you won't believe how easy it is to communicate and even make friends with these people. There are other ways to communicate other than with perfectly grammatical textbook sentences that we were taught in school. Body language, gestures, tone, emotions, and just using your brain, you know, to fill in the blanks. It's not that hard. We today have kind of lost these abilities as so-called civilized Westerners, you know, and more primitive cultures on the regular basis communicate with people of all different languages. Look at India, for God's sake. How many different hundreds or even thousands of languages do they have? There's no problems understanding each other there. And I think this is what Old Norse and English was like too. You know, definitely the countries that have a more anal and uptight grammar in their language, those people are actually the worst at understanding others. My God, the Norwegians are the worst at this. My own people, I love you all, but they are the worst. If you don't speak with perfect grammar in Norwegian, they're not going to understand what the hell you said. They just, huh? is what they say. Okay, fair enough. I grew up outside of Norway most of my childhood, so I have an accent, sure. If you just say one little like mispronunciation or one little preposition out of phrase or whatever, it's fucking yin-yang twins and shit. I go to Denmark, and they understand me a lot better than even Norwegians do. The Danes mumble in their language anyway, and, you know, I love it because they're much better at understanding. Things don't have to be perfect grammar to understand that, and I actually understand Danish better than most Norwegians do because I've traveled so much. The young ones, at least. If we go back in Scandinavia 2-3 generations, back to a time when literacy was definitely lower, Scandinavia used to have their international talks and meetings and diplomacy and all kinds of things. They used to speak their native languages, but now when these younger kids are traveling just to Norway and Sweden, they switch to English. The Germans are bad at this too, by the way. The Germans have a very, very strict grammar, and you know, I lived in Berlin, so you can kind of speak shitty German and get away with it there because there's not many Germans living there. But if you go out to the countryside, your grammar has to be perfect or they're not going to understand a word that you were saying. So that's just my rant. We need to be aware of how ancient humans had a much better understanding of language and communication, even though most of them were illiterate. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you we should calm down and actually listen to a person and their body language and other non-verbal things and use our brains to kind of fill in the blanks when we need to. So that's just my 2 cents along with some history. Go check out that video that I mentioned for a lot more, but that's just my thoughts on all that. Vi ses nästa gång.